Thanks everyone for coming along. I was a little bit concerned that after a hot day, you would be just staying near the water. So I'm glad to see that everyone is here. So I would like first to contextualize my talk. And I would like to say three things, I hope. One is that the very term radical, in a way, is all over the place. It is used apparently to refer to oppositional sections of the political landscape when it is used to refer to the radical right, or when it is used by those who would identify themselves as radical feminists on the left. And what I'm trying to do today through my talk is to expose to what extent and seen from what perspective, from what angle, they overlap. And that is something that is of concern to me. And in a way, that's what makes me do this presentation. The other thing that I would like to say is, and that's in response to the previous 2 days, I really understand that we are in the context of post-democracy. And for me, because I'm going towards the end, I'm going to make use of the affect of trust. What I would like to say is that if we want to talk about this moment of post-democracy, a useful concept about that could be, a concept that is disaffected consent, and it is not mine. The concept of disaffected consent comes from Jeremy Gilbert from 2015, and according to his understanding, it is to grasp the moment when people would feel, how shall I put it, profoundly dissatisfied, but at the same time caught in inhabiting some kind of conformity with the regimes. And this is usually argued by saying that this happens for the lack of any convincing alternative. Okay, so the other motivation to make this talk for me is to try to make some steps in the direction of a convincing position. And the third, what I would like to say is that because I've said that I returned for the second time, and actually today I happen to have Facebook was talking to me, throwing up my album from 5 years ago. So that was really funny, like pure coincidence. But what I would like to single out, because of the specific topic of my talk, I would like to say that it was almost 25 years ago. If you live long enough, you can make these statements. Back in 2005, when in Zagreb, there was the very first transgender studies conference in the whole so-called ex-Soviet bloc. And the title of that conference was "Two is not good enough for gender." And there is also a bilingual publication based on the talks that were delivered at that conference. So in a way, I am running a full circle. Not exactly, but I think I really have to acknowledge that beginning, okay, which ended up me putting together a curriculum in this academic year entitled Transnational. So part of what I have to say is also coming from that. And a warning in a way is that what I am going to deliver today, or rather I'm inviting you to engage with, is based on my ideas from a chapter that is about to be published this November or December, depending on Routledge, and it's an edited volume, and the title of that volume is Decolonial Feminisms, Decolonializing Feminism, Transnational Perspectives. Okay, so it's, in that sense, I have been thinking about this at least for a year or so. We will see. So, first of all, let me reflect on the key concept of radical or radicalism. For me, it entails above all imagining the possibilities of resilience in the context of violent anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism is in the center of what the ever-escalating global radical right-wing regimes, the Hungarian Orbán regime included, routinely call their cultural war against libertarian values. Part of that war entails a systematic attack against gender, the key category of feminist analysis. This hostile political moment requires, more than ever, that we reflect on our own feminist politics, including our principles of categorization, because of the category of gender. Okay. We need to see whether, in our effort to challenge the stigmatization of gender as ideology, our principles of distinctions have obscured or precluded further marginalizations. Such a self-reflexive radical project should include embarrassing but necessary questions, such as, have our apparently feminist contestations of the illiberal regime's attacks on gender ended up as mere deflection of our negative publicity at the expense of trans or non-binary people through reiterating some white colonial feminism? So that's a question for me. The question is enunciated from the perspective of the minoritarian and draws attention to the radical forms of exclusion. The self-critical shift is indispensable for a radical feminist futurity of equal standing. As Judith Butler, in her 2015 book, notes toward the performative theory of assembly underscores, quote, to be radically deprived of recognition threatens the very possibility of existing and persisting, end of quote. That is, a radical feminist project of horizontal organizing should consider those who are radically exposed to violence without basic political protections by forms of law and become disposable and in that sense unrecognized. So a radical democratic polity should take all forms of life of equal value, non-human forms of life included, and challenge decisions, values, and practices that push people to live in radically unsupported conditions of precarity. To quote Butler, for the struggle for the rights of gender and sexual minorities to be a social justice struggle, that is, for it to be characterized as a radical democratic project, it's necessary to realize that we are but one population who has been and can be exposed to conditions of precarity and disenfranchisement. And I would like to add Butler's ideas that this radical plurality is all the more necessary if we understand the current form of neoliberal capitalism to be precarity capitalism, as it has been defined and discussed by Alvina Asmanova in her 2020 book that was published by Columbia University Press, and the title of which is Capitalism on Edge: How Fighting Precarity Can Achieve Radical Change Without Crisis or Utopia. Okay, so where do I come from and where am I heading to? I'd like to contribute to the theme of the conference, Radical Reorientation of Feminist Theories, as a scholar whose main interest lies in exploring the ideological work of meaning making. My major tenet is that the majority of feminist contestations of the illiberal anti-gender politics centers on the very meaning of the concept gender. That is, the social struggle has centered directly on the meaning and the proper use of gender. Language enters in the gender and sexual politics then in two ways. It is not only the medium in which the social political conflicts are played out, but more importantly, language or language use itself becomes the focus for a conflict in its own right. Seen from the perspective of the latter, the existing so-called radical feminist discourse in Hungary is problematic in my reading on two accounts. In its attempt at formulating a radical feminist democratic project, firstly, it advocates and conflates various relations of power into a fundamentalist concept of class. Secondly, their understanding of class relations conveniently disregard the cross-cutting colonial and racial relations of power. Consequently, for a radical reorientation, we need to address the question of how to decolonialize this feminist thinking that is most explicitly present in the attempts at rebiologizing a binary sex that could work as if the basis for gender. In the past 7 years or so, I have mostly studied the anti-gender discourses of the Hungarian government's propaganda. And my major interest has been to explore the systematic stigmatization of any meaning and presentation of femininity, masculinity, beyond the fundamentalist binary meaning of biological sex as the anchorage of gender. In that work, I did not stop at exposing the order of hate discourse and the particular range of figures of hate by mobilizing the affect of fear. I also wanted to underscore, like now, and show that once the rhetoric of fear works and persists as dominant, it will not bring about a demarcation line between the political right and left, the regime and its opposition, including its feminist opposition. Dominant means to cut across that convenient line. Most recently, I am more concerned with two intertwined aims. On the one hand, I deconstruct the limits of the so-called radical feminist disposition against the government's hostile labeling of gender and ideology in order to point out that against its own intentions, the radical feminist stance comes forth in the government's hate rhetoric for multiple reasons. On the other hand, and more importantly, I propose to build a feminist solidarity of plurality that can affirm multiple mutual dependencies, mobilized by the affect of trust instead of the dominance of hate and fear. I have pointed out that the conceptualization of class relations is in the center of interest by the Hungarian radical feminists. Class is the explicitly articulated element of the gender critical disposition when disidentifying with trans people's claim to a life worth living. The radical feminists argue that the government should be partly right, hence their gender critical stance, when calling gender an ideology. Because, they argue, trans people's use of gender is an act of misappropriation. As a political strategy, they propose to recenter what they see the right meaning of the term and articulate for the general public. This agenda is formulated as an act of self-criticism, pointing out that we feminists did not do our best to make the citizenry understand what gender in actual fact is, making us defenseless in the face of the government's hate propaganda. They believe that we need to propose a definition of gender. Let me observe, this is an inevitably decontextualizing position that produces a universal category. They propose we can achieve such a proper meaning when focused on the real forms of injustice, that is, the so-called structural forms of economic exploitation of class relations in neoliberal capitalism. In the face of the fundamentalist attacks on gender, the feminists of the progressive left argue that trans activism and their alleged queer feminist framework have become complicit with neoliberalism due to their identity-based political agenda, which is far from the real problems of structural forms of exploitation. Their most vocal voice, Esther Kovacs, would say, my thesis, which I would like to discuss below, is that though on the surface, these anti-gender movements against gender equality and or LGBT plus rights are actually symptoms of a deeper crisis in which gender is not an end goal, but a symbolic link that engages many questions. End of quote. In my reading, the formulation of the aim is informed by a binary distinction between gender when misused, either by the government or the LGBT plus activists, as a matter of symbolic, in this case linguistic representation, that is not part of the social problem, i.e. that of the deeper crisis of neoliberal capitalism, but it is only its index belonging in the superstructure only. And it is one that by implication cannot be grasped as a structural and systematic form of injustice. Now, as a linguist, it makes me more than upset. This criticism separates struggle for rights and recognition as if non-structural from struggles against structural inequality implicating injustice of redistribution as the deeper cause of the previous. In my reading, according to this logic, the future for the progressive left, including feminism, seems to hinge ultimately on the subordination of gender inequality to class, precluding the dialectic possibility that gender may be a modality through which class is linked, which is completely against, in my understanding, of any progressive neo-Marxist criticism of precarity capitalism. So, for the rest of my talk, I would like to revisit my criticism of the universalizing effects of the essentializing meaning of class, and pointed out, and this is the contribution to what I have done so far, that the self-identifying radical disposition comes entangled in what Arvin et al. Calls widespread feminism. The Hungarian government and the radical feminists, otherwise oppositional dispositions, share an empiricist effort to rebiologize gender. The government's rhetoric appeals to the idea that the nation is deserving to live without fear, which in fact mobilizes a racialized hierarchy of biological plasticity with Christian reproductivity at the top, embodied by the traditional figure of the reproductive white femininity. Whenever the oppositional feminist discourse comes forth in this discourse of biologization, it is informed by the hope for some relative gains at the expense of those less valuable embodiedness on the hierarchical scale. Eventually, their position is to counter the visibility of cisness as the relatively different element of embodiment that has been foregrounded by trans claims to livable life. Paradoxically, they share the government's universalization of a particular form of embodiment and hold it up as if a natural body, an asocial, pre-social materiality of the flesh. They jointly reiterate what Jenny Avant calls the racialized hierarchy of biological plasticity. Avant points out that, ironically, anti-gender discourses implicate white European cis male subjects as the allegedly most vulnerable targets, while promising them the position of the most successful survivors of genderism. Consequently, gender-critical feminists cannot hang on to that logic unless they are ready to embrace this injurious neo-colonializing rhetoric that cannot hold out the promise of empowerment for all forms of gendered life, not even for the white working class cis woman in the center of their concerns, because we are still within a hierarchy. Instead of producing some alleged coherence by violently disqualifying trans forms of embodied knowledge, I propose an intersectional transfeminist approach to gender. It also requires contesting the viability of pitting reasons against one another, which can only underscore difference as insurmountable and absolute over and against the other. It is mobilizable only in a fight for the right plot of organizing and theorizing. This time, for the right plot of narrating sexual difference. I rather argue for the viability of relative distinctions that can be productive of multiple plots of gender or sexuality. This transversal logic, as defined by Yuval Davis, is the one that may enable us to sideline a neoliberal nostalgia for progressive politics that is informed by the ideology of the same. This intersectional plurality, however, allows us to see that, to quote Butler, the right for which we struggle are plural rights, and that plurality is not circumscribed in advance by identity. That is, it is not a struggle to which only some identities can belong, and it is surely a struggle that seeks to expand what we mean when we say we. End of quote. Instead of buying into the dominant order of discourse of hate, I propose that accentuating of relative similarities of vulnerability is the way to go. That may bring about a solidarity that is organized by the intertwined dynamic of agreeing and disagreeing. It can be a formation of recognition of multiple, equally valuable plots of gender struggle that nevertheless acknowledges the indispensability of discomfort. For this conceptualization of solidarity, I draw on Claire Hemming's suggestion that a transformative feminist politics begins from experiences of discomfort without generalizing these as shared by all subjects or as the basis of transcendence of difference. I read this solidarity as a space of trust where participants can trust the others, not only because they know that they agree to some extent, but also because they know they can also disagree without running the risk of stigmatization and betrayal as a dispensable form of life, as ungrievable members of us. These formations of trust can be spaces of social care for healing our injuries and strengthening our rage in the service of the restoration of power to fight on.